I came home 3 days early and nobody knew. That was the point. I wanted to surprise my wife for her birthday. She turned 62 on December 28th, and every year since we moved to the island, I've tried to do something that catches her off guard. She never expects much from me anymore. Not because I've let her down, but because after 38 years she knows how I think, knows my rhythms, can predict my movements almost before I make them. So the only real surprise left is showing up when she's not expecting me. I'd been in Calgary for 11 days, consulting on a commercial development project, a mixed-use property near the Bow River that a firm there had brought me in to assess. I'm a retired civil engineer, but I still take occasional contracts. Keeps me sharp. The project wrapped 2 days early, and instead of spending an extra night in that hotel watching hockey highlights alone, I booked the first available flight back to Victoria. I didn't call. I didn't text. I just came home. Our house is on the Saanich Peninsula, north of the city. We bought it 26 years ago when the kids were still young, back when that part of Vancouver Island still felt like the edge of the world. Quiet roads, Garry Oak meadows, the ocean visible from almost every window. I built the workshop myself in the backyard, and my wife, Bet, planted the garden along the south fence and never stopped adding to it. That house is as much a part of us as anything we've ever done together. It was almost 9 in the evening when the taxi turned off the main road. I paid the driver and asked him to leave the bag at the end of the driveway, not wanting the headlights to sweep across the windows. I had this foolish image of myself walking through the front door, Bet startled at the kitchen table, then laughing, then hugging me. That was the picture in my head. What I actually saw stopped me cold. The lights were blazing in every room. Both vehicles were in the driveway. Ours and another one I didn't recognize. A gray SUV with Ontario plates. I could hear voices through the front window. Several of them, and music playing at a volume Bet never would have chosen on her own. She has a sensitivity to sound that I've teased her about for decades. I stood at the end of the driveway for a moment, just listening. I didn't go to the front door. Something made me walk around the side of the house instead, through the gate and along the stone path that leads to the back deck. The kitchen light was on. I could see shapes moving inside. And then I saw her. Bet was sitting alone on the deck steps, wrapped in her old wool cardigan, the dark green one she's had since before we were married. She was holding a mug in both hands and staring out at the garden. Not reading, not doing anything, just sitting, and even from across the yard, in the dark, I could see that her shoulders were pulled in close, the way they get when she's been crying. Inside the kitchen, through the glass door behind her, I could see my son Kyle and his wife Renata laughing at something on a phone. Renata's mother, Odette, was pouring herself wine from a bottle she'd clearly brought, and her father, Aldous, a man I've never been able to tolerate for reasons I'll explain, was leaning back in a chair at my kitchen table as though he owned it. My wife was alone in the cold. Her birthday was 3 days away, and nobody inside had noticed she'd stepped out. I crossed the yard quietly. Bet heard my footsteps on the gravel and turned, and for a moment I thought she might make a sound, call out something, but she just led to me with an expression I'll never forget. Relief and exhaustion and something else, something that looked a lot like shame, which made no sense at all because she had done nothing wrong. I held a finger to my lips. She nodded. I sat down beside her on the step and put my arm around her, and she leaned into me without a word. We sat there for a few minutes. The voices inside carried on, completely unaware. "How long?" I said, barely above a whisper. 4 days, she said. 4 days. They'd been here for 4 days without telling me. We left through the side gate, the same way I'd come in. I had a key to the workshop, and I kept a spare set of car keys on the hook inside the door. We took Bet's car, and I drove us to a hotel in Sydney, a small place by the water where I know the owner from a Renee project years back. He sorted us out without questions. We sat in the room, and Bet told me everything. Kyle had called her 3 weeks earlier saying he and Renata wanted to come out for the holidays, that the kids needed to see their grandparents, that it had been too long. Bet said yes immediately. She always says yes to Kyle, always has. It's one of the things I love about her and also one of the things that worries me. Then 4 days ago, without warning, Renata's parents showed up too. Not a question, not a suggestion. They just appeared with luggage, and since then, the conversations had begun. Subtle at first. This house must be a lot to manage on your own. Then more direct. Have you and Dad thought about what happens with the property eventually? Then, blunter still, Aldous one evening over dinner apparently said that a house of this size and location, he'd looked it up, she said, actually looked it up online while sitting at our table, was worth somewhere in the range of 2.8 to 3 million in the current market. He said it casually, like he was reading a weather forecast. He said you should think about transferring it to Kyle now, Bet told me. Something about probate costs. About how it would simplify things. He kept using the phrase, future planning. And Kyle? She paused. Kyle nodded. I sat with that for a moment. Our son, our only child, 34 years old, sitting at our kitchen table nodding while his father-in-law talked about our property like it was already theirs. Did you tell them no? I said I needed to talk to you, that nothing could happen without you. She looked at her hands. That made Renata upset. She said I was making it more complicated than it needed to be, that you would agree if you just understood the tax advantages. And Kyle, he said, Mom, Dad always overthinks things. He'll come around. He'll come around. I asked her about tonight, about why she'd been sitting outside alone while they were all inside. She said Aldous had brought papers. An actual document, printed and folded in a leather folder, prepared by someone, a paralegal he knew in Toronto. He'd placed it on the kitchen table after dinner, and told her it was straightforward, that all she needed to do was sign and they'd take care of the rest. When she said she wasn't signing anything without speaking to me first, Renata said she was being irrational. Kyle said nothing, and Odette patted her hand and said, Sweetie, you know you can trust us. She'd excused herself to get some air and hadn't gone back inside. I held her hand and didn't say anything for a while. Then I told her I was going to handle it. The first call I made was to our family lawyer in Victoria. His name is Jeffrey, and he's been handling our affairs since we incorporated the original engineering firm 30 years ago. It was nearly 11 at night. He answered on the third ring, heard the situation in about 2 minutes, and said he could have documents prepared by morning. I told him what I needed. Our property transferred into a joint family trust with Bet as the sole surviving trustee, a full revision of my will removing Kyle as primary beneficiary, and a new directive specifying that in the event of any attempt to contest or coerce changes to the estate, the entire estate transfers to the University of Victoria's Scholarship Fund for Engineering students. He said, That's aggressive. I said, What they did to Bet tonight is aggressive. He said he'd have everything ready by 8. The second call was to a locksmith. There's a company in Saanich I've used for the workshop and the rental property we used to own. I explained what I needed. Every exterior lock changed, new keypad installed on the back door, new codes issued to myself and Bet only. He offered to come at 6 in the morning for an emergency rate, plus a bonus I agreed to without negotiating. I didn't care. The third call was harder to make. I have a contact in the RCMP detachment, a fellow I'd known for years through community infrastructure work, a man named Sergeant Fowler. I called his personal number and told him what had happened. Pressure on my wife to sign property documents, a folder of papers produced by an out-of-province paralegal. 4 days of targeted coercion while I was away. He was quiet for a moment and then said that what I was describing could constitute undue influence, which is a civil matter, but that showing up with an officer to facilitate their removal from private property was something he could assist with, given the circumstances. I said I'd call him in the morning when the documents were ready. Bet fell asleep around 2. I sat in the chair by the window and watched the water for a while. I thought about Kyle at age 8. The summer we spent rebuilding the back fence together, him handing me nails with total seriousness, asking the engineering questions he'd invented himself. I thought about his university graduation, the way he shook my hand on the stage lawn afterward, proud and slightly embarrassed by it all. I thought about the morning he called to tell us Renata was pregnant the first time, and how Bet cried for 20 minutes after hanging up, just from happiness. I don't know exactly when that son became someone who could sit at my table and say nothing while his wife's father pressured his mother to sign documents she didn't understand. But somewhere along the way, that's what happened. At 6, the locksmith arrived. I let him in and walked him through the house while Bet slept. He changed everything efficiently and without commentary, which I appreciated. New keys, new codes, new deadbolts on the front and back. He was done by 8:15. At 8:30, Jeffrey called to confirm the documents had been drafted, reviewed, and were ready for my signature. I drove to his office, signed everything, and he walked me through each page. The trust was ironclad, he said. Under BC law, with the transfer properly registered, there was no mechanism by which Kyle or anyone acting on his behalf could compel a change. And the will revision was straightforward. If Kyle wanted to contest, he was welcome to try. But Jeffrey had documented the circumstances thoroughly enough that any challenge would be expensive and almost certainly unsuccessful. I asked him to file everything that morning. He did. At 9:45, I drove back to our house. Sergeant Fowler met me at the end of the driveway with a constable. I appreciated that he hadn't made it a production. 2 officers, 1 vehicle, professional but not theatrical. I knocked on my own front door. There was a pause, some shuffling, and then Kyle opened it. He was in a t-shirt and flannel pants, clearly just up. When he saw me, something crossed his face. Surprise first, then something more complicated. "Dad, you back early?" "I am. I didn't know you, Kyle." "Kyle," I kept my voice steady. "I need you to wake up Renata and her parents and tell them they need to leave." He stared at me. "What?" Sergeant Fowler stepped into his line of sight. "These are private premises," the sergeant said, not unkindly. "The registered owner has requested that all guests vacate. We're here to facilitate that. We're not guests, we're family." Kyle's voice had gone tight. "You arrived without my knowledge," I said. "You've been here 4 days without my permission. And last night, while I was in Alberta, your father-in-law placed legal documents in front of your mother and pressured her to sign them. I have her account of that. I have documentation, and I have witnesses. So I'm going to say this once. Wake them up, pack your things, and leave. You have 45 minutes. The rest of it isn't worth describing in detail." There was shouting. Aldous, mostly, using words like unreasonable and overreaction, and didn't mean any harm. Renata cried, which might have been real, I genuinely don't know. Odette appealed to me several times using my name in a warm voice, like that would help. Kyle said almost nothing. He packed a bag, moved through the house quietly, and when he passed me in the hallway, he looked at me for a moment, and then looked away. They were gone by 11. I went through the house and opened windows. Made coffee. Put the folder of documents Aldous had brought in an envelope for Jeffrey to review. Cleaned up the kitchen, which they'd left in a state. Put fresh flowers in a vase on the table. Bet has a thing about the kitchen looking right, and drove back to the hotel to get her. She walked into the house and stood in the kitchen for a moment. "It smells like it's ours again," she said. "We spent her birthday the way we've spent the best ones. Just the 2 of us. A bottle of Okanagan Red, dinner from the Portuguese place she loves in Sydney, a long walk along the water." She didn't ask many questions about what I'd done legally. She trusted me, the way she's always trusted me, and I didn't take that lightly. The calls from Kyle started the following week. Some angry, some confused, some that sounded scripted. Like Renata was standing nearby. I read them all and didn't respond to any. Then a letter arrived, handwritten, which surprised me. He said he knew what he'd done was wrong. He said he hadn't known about the documents until the night before. That Aldous had presented the whole thing as a fait accompli, a favor he was doing for the family, and that Kyle had gone along with it because he didn't know how to push back against that man without blowing up his marriage. I believed parts of that, not all of it. What I knew for certain was this. Kyle had watched his mother go outside alone in the cold, while a man he'd married into dismissed her in her own kitchen, and he'd done nothing. That wasn't Aldous's fault. That wasn't Renata's fault. That was Kyle. I called him 6 weeks later. Told him I'd read his letter. Told him I wasn't interested in an explanation right now. Only in whether he understood the difference between what he'd allowed to happen and what a man his age, in his position, should have done. He said he did. I said I wasn't sure I believed him yet, but I was willing to be persuaded. What that would require, I told him, was time, not an apology tour, not gestures, just consistent, quiet evidence over months and years that he understood what family actually meant. Not an inheritance, not a property transfer, not a transaction. A relationship, the real kind, built on showing up when it cost you something. He asked if he could still see his mother. I told him that was Bet's decision, not mine. And when I asked Bet, she said she needed a few months before she was ready, not because she didn't love him. She loved him fiercely, the way mothers love difficult children, which is a specific and relentless kind of love. But because she needed to trust him again first, and trust takes time to rebuild. 3 months later, Kyle drove out from Victoria alone. No Renata. He asked Bet if he could take her to lunch. She said yes. They went to the place by the Butchart Gardens she's always liked, and she called me after and said it had been good. Quiet and a little awkward and genuinely good. He was separated from Renata by then, not because of what had happened at our house, or not only because of it. He told me later that the weeks after they left it made something clear to him that he'd been avoiding for a long time, that he'd spent years letting Aldous set the agenda for his family, letting Renata make decisions he should have been part of, folding into the shape of a son-in-law rather than being himself. The incident at our house was the loudest version of something that had been happening quietly for years. I didn't tell him I was glad they were separating. That's not my place. But I wasn't sorry either. He found a position with a structural engineering firm in Victoria, not through me, not through anyone I knew. He'd sent in an application on his own, gotten an interview on his own, accepted the job on his own. I found out about it from a colleague who'd been on the hiring committee, who mentioned it casually over coffee one afternoon. Kyle hadn't told me. Which meant he wasn't doing it for my benefit. He was doing it because he needed work. And he finally understood that work was how you built a life. That meant something. Bet and I watched him carefully over the next year. Not with suspicion, with the cautious attention of people who've been hurt and want to make sure they're not being foolish. Kyle visited when he could, helped me reshingle part of the workshop roof in the fall, which was more physically useful than I expected from him. Brought the kids, our 2 grandchildren, a girl of 6 and a boy of 9 who ran to the garden and demanded pancakes and left muddy handprints on the back door, and filled the house with the kind of noise that makes every room feel bigger. We barely seen them. That was the part that sat with me most heavily. While Kyle and Renata had been building their life in Toronto and then back in BC, while the tension with them had slowly calcified into something managed and joyless, those kids had been growing up largely without us. Photograph grandparents, the ones in the pictures. And that was time I couldn't recover. I said that to Kyle one afternoon, the 2 of us in the workshop. I know, he said. He was sanding a piece of cedar trim I'd been putting off for months. He didn't say it defensively, he just said it. I'm not going to hold it over you, I said, but I want you to understand what was lost. I do understand it. Because your grandchildren are going to ask you one day. They're going to want to know why they didn't know us when they were small, and you'll have to answer that. He nodded, kept sanding. What will you tell them? He was quiet for a moment. That I made choices I'm not proud of. That I let other people make decisions I should have made myself, and that I spent a long time after that trying to be the father and son I should have been from the start. He looked up. And that your grandfather forgave me. Slowly. With conditions. But he did. I didn't correct him. About 1.5 years after the incident, Renata called me. I almost didn't answer. I saw her name on the screen, hesitated. But I picked up. She was brief. She said she wasn't calling to relitigate anything or to ask for anything. She said she'd been in therapy since the separation, and that one of the things she'd had to look at, honestly, was what had happened in our house. She said her father had presented the whole property scheme as something Kyle was behind, as something Kyle had asked him to help coordinate. She'd believed that because it was easier to believe than the alternative, that her father was simply running his own agenda and using her marriage to do it. I don't know if that changes anything for you, she said. It doesn't change what happened, I said. But I appreciate you telling me. Your wife was kind to me, she said. Even that week. She was kind when she had no reason to be. I've thought about that a lot. After she hung up, I sat with that for a while, because it was true. Bet is kind in that deep, habitual way that some people are. Not because they're passive, but because they've decided it's worth the effort. It's one of the things that made what happened to her that week so unacceptable. Kindness isn't weakness. Taking advantage of it is. The legal changes I made that night have stayed in place. The trust, the revised will, all of it. Jeffrey reviews it with me each year. Kyle knows about the disinheritance. I told him plainly, not as a punishment but as a fact. He said, I understand. And when I waited to see if he'd push back, he just said, Dad, I'm not building my life around what you leave behind. I'm not doing that anymore. That was the right answer. I don't know if he entirely meant it. But he said it, and that's where it starts. 2 years after the incident, Kyle was made a junior partner at the firm. He called me when it happened, which was new. Not to tell me, not to report in, just to share it. The way you share something good with someone you're genuinely close to. We talked for 40 minutes about the project he'd been leading, a mixed-use development in Langford, and he asked my opinion on a structural question he was wrestling with. And I gave it, and he pushed back on part of my answer with a point that was actually better than mine. I told him so. He laughed. It was the first time in years I'd heard him laugh like that. Uncomplicated. Easy. Not performing anything. Last spring, Bet's birthday again. 64 this time. We had a small gathering at the house. Kyle and the grandchildren, a few neighbors. Jeffrey and his wife, nothing large. Kyle made a point of cooking, which I'd never seen him do before. Apparently he'd been taking it seriously since the separation, feeding himself and the kids properly. He made a lamb shoulder and a potato thing that was better than it had any right to be. Bet sat at the head of the kitchen table in her garden, at the home she's always loved, and laughed at something one of the grandchildren said. A real laugh, head back, the one she doesn't manufacture. I watched from the doorway for a moment before anyone noticed me. She looked happy, the real kind, not the performed kind she'd been doing for too long, managing things, smoothing things over, sitting alone on the back step in the cold, because there was nowhere else to be. I thought about that night in December, when I found her there, and about the hours that followed, the calls, the locksmith, the morning light coming up over the inlet while I sat in the hotel and decided what kind of person I was going to be about all of it. I could have let it go. I could have told myself it was a misunderstanding, that family is complicated, that Aldous hadn't really meant it that way, that Kyle was just caught in the middle, that making peace was worth swallowing a certain amount of what had happened. But Bet had been sitting outside in the cold on the night before her birthday while people plotted in her kitchen. And she'd said nothing to me because she didn't want to be a burden. There's a version of love that absorbs everything and asks for nothing and calls itself sacrifice. I've seen it destroy people slowly. Bet deserved better than that version. She deserved to be defended. So I defended her. Kyle is not the person he was. I can't say that with absolute certainty, because I've learned to hold that kind of certainty loosely, but the evidence, sustained now over more than 2 years, points in one direction. And Bet believes in him, which counts for more than my assessment. That's enough for now. It's not everything we had before, but it's real, and it's ours. And we built it out of something that was almost completely broken. That's more than most people get. If there's one thing I'd want someone to take from this, not a lesson, I'm not trying to teach anyone anything, it's just this. The moments that define you don't always announce themselves. I came home to surprise my wife for her birthday. I found her sitting alone in the dark, and what I did in the hours that followed set the course for everything that came after. Not because I was righteous, because I was paying attention. I've thought about that night a lot since it happened. Not obsessively, I'm not built that way. But in the quiet moments, the early mornings on the back deck with coffee, when the light is still low over the water and the garden is just starting to come into color, I think about what I found when I came home and what I chose to do about it, and what followed from that choice. There's a kind of cause and effect that runs through every family, though most people don't want to look at it too directly. The things you allow become the things that happen. The silence you keep in one moment becomes the expectation someone else builds their plans around. All this didn't arrive at my kitchen table with a folder of documents by accident. He arrived because somewhere along the line, the signals he received suggested it was possible. That's not an excuse for what he did, but it's the truth of how these situations develop. Nobody conspires in a vacuum. What I did that night wasn't revenge in any dramatic sense. I didn't enjoy making those calls. I didn't enjoy standing at my own front door with a sergeant at my shoulder, watching my son pack a bag in his old bedroom. None of it felt good. What it felt like was necessary. The way setting a broken bone is necessary, not pleasant, not something you'd choose if there were an easier option, but required if you want the thing to heal correctly. Kyle had to understand that actions carry weight. He'd spent a long time, I think, believing that I would absorb whatever happened because I was his father, and that's what fathers do. And for a long time, that was even true. But absorbing everything isn't love. It's avoidance dressed up as generosity. Real love, the kind that actually serves someone, sometimes looks like consequence. Sometimes it looks like a changed lock and a revised will and a very clear conversation about what you will and will not accept. The 3 years that followed, watching him work, watching him struggle, watching him slowly become someone who could sand cedar trim in a workshop and push back on a structural argument with a point better than mine. That was the part that mattered. Not the night of. The night of was just the moment I stopped absorbing and started being honest. The years after were where the actual thing happened. Bet is the one I think about most when I reflect on all of it. She sat outside in the cold on the eve of her birthday rather than cause a scene. She said nothing to me for weeks because she didn't want to be a burden. She endured 4 days of sustained pressure in her own home and apologized to me for not handling it better. That's the person I married, someone whose instinct is to protect everyone around her, including the people who are taking advantage of her. My job, the one I signed up for 38 years ago, is to protect her. Not from discomfort. Life has discomfort. That's unavoidable. But from being diminished. From being made to feel that her kindness is a weakness someone can exploit. That's the line. And when I came home and saw her sitting on those steps in the dark, I knew exactly where the line was and exactly how far past it things had gone. I don't have a tidy summary to offer. Families are not tidy. Ours is better now than it was, and more honest than it's ever been. And that's worth something real. Kyle is a man I respect, which I couldn't say 3 years ago. Bet laughed at our kitchen table last spring. The real kind, and that's what I was trying to get back to all along. Pay attention to what's in front of you. Defend what matters, and understand that letting something go unchallenged is also a choice. One with its own consequences, its own long trail of effects you'll be living with for years. That's all I know.